I welcome here on the launch pad, give it up for Tom Woods!
Hey, glad to be back.
Man, it's great to have you back. Every time you come on, we had just a blast. We really did. Mr. Woods, really quick, just before we wrap this up, I know you have a limited time with us, but for tradition and tradition purposes only, would you like to play Rocket Fire?
Oh, for crying out loud, how could I not? And I'm so bad at this, by the way. You know, Michael Malice is great at this stuff, where it's a question that gets thrown at him. Not only does he have an immediate answer, he has a witty answer that is devastating, like he's thrown a machete across the room. I am the exact opposite of this. I have these plodding, awful answers. So just understand that we have to measure my worth in ways other than how I accomplish this particular lightning round.
All right. Well, Mr. Woods, are you ready to play Rocket Fire?
All right. Yes.
All right. Question 1. Was child labor necessary, especially from a historical perspective?
Wait a minute. I can't remember. How long can my answers be? Like 10 seconds?
30 to 60 seconds.
Oh, under 6? Oh, yeah. Okay. Answer. Child labor is highly undesirable, but obviously necessary in societies where they have very little capital, because without it, families starve to death. And there are worse things than child labor, namely mass starvation. That's why families do it even now in some of the more backward parts of the world. Even the World Health Organization admits the reason that there is child labor is that without it, the families would starve. What you need is more capitalism, more capital to create more physical abundance, and therefore you don't need the child's labor anymore, and you can send the kid to school or do something else with them other than work.
All right, on. Question 2. Is there such thing as a free market monopoly?
No, there isn't. There may be just one firm, but that doesn't make it a monopoly, because there is always potential competition. Alcoa was the aluminum supplier for a long time, but it kept its prices super low because it knew there were substitutes for aluminum. There were always potential competitors. And even the courts admitted this when they brought Alcoa into the courts, and they said, well, look, how could anyone compete with you? You keep prices so low.
Right.
Well, okay. Well, if they keep prices so low, what's the problem?
Right on. Question 3. Do people really believe in equality?
I don't think so, because if they did, they would move to Malawi, one of the, if not the poorest country in the world. They would give away all their stuff. They wouldn't just complain about the 1% in the U.S. They would say, wait a minute, in the globe, I'm the 1%. The average American is in the 1% for the whole globe.
Right.
And so the rest of the world is the 99%. And so therefore, you should give away your house and your car and not have a college education until all these other people have those things. Nobody's doing that, so I don't believe it.
Right on. Question 4. What do you prefer, Bitcoin or gold?
Oh, that's terrible. That one I can't answer, because I think there's a merit in both, and I hold both.
Okay, very cool. Question 5. Have anti-discrimination laws been helpful to society or a harm, and should they be abolished today?
They've probably been helpful for some people, but for society as a whole, I think their merits have been exaggerated. For example, the statistics on, let's say, Black employment and Hispanic employment and Asian employment show no acceleration in these trends after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. These were trends that were already existing for increased employment for all these groups. So, first of all, we've exaggerated the extent that government has solved this problem. But secondly, it's led to an extremely litigious society where everybody alleges discrimination at every turn. So everybody's terrified in the labor market. And plus, it makes people assume that people of certain backgrounds are probably unqualified because they got in because of anti-discrimination law, so-called. It makes people say, well, gee, do I want to go to that doctor? Did that doctor really satisfy the requirements the same way everybody else did? So it puts a stigma on those people, and it's unfair to everybody.
I agree. Question 6. If an employer takes government subsidies, should they still be able to punish private employees of their company for free speech issues?
Oh, that's a technical one. I would need an example of what you mean.
So if I'm a business and I take government subsidies, which I am therefore technically not really a public entity, could I still fire them if I don't agree with what they say?
I guess I would say yes, simply because if I give any other answer, then almost any firm could be alleged to be getting government subsidies, because they would say, well, you're using the government roads, you use the government postal service, the government subsidized 3 of the inventions that you used. They'll come up with all kinds of rationales to why I can't run my business the way I want. So I tend to want to nip it in the bud.
I'm with you on that. Good answer.
Question 7.
Are the homeless violating people's property rights by camping on public property? Let's just say in front of your house or your business, for example.
Well, that's hard to answer because whose property is it? Is public property government property? Well, I don't think government acquires property legitimately. Is public property really the property of the people? Well, in that case, what do? Have a democratic vote as to how the property is to be used? Do we vote to kick that person off? This is the problem with public property. It's hard to know exactly what should happen. On my private property, if I want to invite you in and give you a warm meal and a place to sleep, that's my prerogative. If I want to say go jump in a lake, that's also my prerogative. We wind up in all these interminable disputes because there's no clear owner. So I wouldn't say they're violating any clear property right, but I would say it's best to just privatize all these things so we can come up with a rational, peaceful solution that satisfies everybody.
Great answer. Tom, you're doing great. Perfect.
Thanks.
You're doing good. You're doing great.
I thought it was going to be like 10-second answers. I stink at those.
No, you're doing great.
Question 8.
Does public nudity violate anyone's rights?
Well, again, what do we mean by public? It depends on who owns the property.
Right.
So what it boils down to is if you have a private beach, it's all private property, do whatever the heck you want to do on that beach. But public, well, again, if it's public property, does that mean I own it? Like you and I together collectively own it? The government owns it? Well, whoever the owner is makes the rules. And the problem is, as with schooling, well, with public schooling, what's supposed to be taught? Do we teach this? Do we teach that? Do we teach this language? Do we teach that language? It's interminable. Unless there's private property, there is no way to answer this. So you're not strictly violating anybody's rights. But at the same time, if we say, can bums sleep in the library because it's publicly funded? Well, I don't know. Does that mean we have to have that position? How about the fact that since I'm being robbed to support the library in the first place, to add insult to injury, you make me deal with violent, aggressive people while I'm there? Maybe you could enforce some sensible rules that would approximate what a private owner would enforce.
Right on. Right on.
Question 9.
Historically, has there ever been a government program that actually may have done some good?
I think there are plenty of government programs that have done some good. The question is, compared to what? Of course, look,
That's
if governments take billions and billions and billions and trillions of dollars from you and they accomplish no good whatsoever, that would be a miracle. I mean, of course, these people have to fall ass backwards into something good once in a while. And like they do build a building that you could find some use for. The point is, what would we have done with those resources otherwise? Obviously, we would have done something that's higher, that has a higher value in people's minds because you didn't have to steal the money for it to go into those purposes. All we can know is we've lost some utility because people did not voluntarily consent to whatever the project was.
Exactly. The seen and the unseen.
Question 10.
Can someone be free and ignorant?
Well, sure. I know people say, well, if you're ignorant, then it'll be easier for people to take advantage of you and enslave you. That's true. That's why we want there to be as little ignorance as possible. It depends on how you define ignorance, because there are a lot of people who have had a lot of formal schooling who have been quite happy to enslave themselves or to enslave others. Whereas, I think there are plenty of people who are amiable dolts who will get by just fine. It would never occur to them to vote for some New Deal or vote for something to run other people's lives. They're happy to just run their own lives. They're modest enough to know their own limitations. It's the smart people who think they have the skills to run everybody else's lives that I'm more worried about.
Right on. And that's Rocket Fire. Give it up for Mr. Tom Woods. Yeah.
Jeez, that was hard.
Was it really? I thought you did great, man.
Oh, thanks, but I got to go take a nap. My brain isn't supposed to work that fast. I'm supposed to ask a question, the guest answers for 5 minutes, I relax, stretch, whatever. This is nuts.
You did great. That was fun.
I have to say, I did enjoy that. Thank you.
That was the final Rocket Fire from the Johnny Rocket Launchpad. And Tom, I don't know if you have any .coms you want to give out before you roll, because I know you got a boogie.
I have a couple. Do please visit me at tomwoods.com. And I know a lot of people, they don't want to get email, but that's because you haven't read my emails. I send out good, meaty, fun, informative, devastating, killer emails that people in the know enjoy reading. And you should hop onto that list. You can get one of my free I got ebooks on every topic libertarians have to struggle with, like, oh, if you were in charge, there'd be no schools and everybody would be an idiot and all that. All these things that you hear, I got a little ebook to help smash all of them over at tomsfreebooks.com. And when you get one of those free books, you get added onto my free newsletter, which with one click you can unsubscribe from, but you'd have to have something wrong with you mentally to want to do that.
Yeah, they're great. They're great. I get your newsletters. I read them. I think they're great. And actually, that's where I got that question about equality. Does everyone want equality? And that was a newsletter you had just recently.
I've been harping on equality for a couple of days because whenever I can't think of something to write about, I write about equality because I just there's so much propaganda about it. It's just an endless supply of emails.
Always an issue.
It's always an issue. There's, we want equality. No, you don't. No, you don't. If you really wanted equality. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom. Mr. Woods, thank you so much for being here. It was a great honor for you to be here on our last official show.
The pleasure is mine. Thanks to both of you.
The Tom Woods Show, episode 1191.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Homeschooling parents, it's going to be time to start thinking about next year before you know it. Let me recommend to you the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum, which I've been using with my daughters. It's going to preserve your mental health while it gives them a top-notch education. Plus, get $160 worth of free bonuses when you use my link, ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. This is my Independence Day episode. It has a little bit to do with Independence Day because at the end, we talk about what there is to celebrate about Independence Day a little bit, as I recall, if I remember this interview correctly, because this is actually an appearance I made on the Libertarian Christian Podcast over at libertarianchristians.com. And as I recall, I don't think it had anything to do with Christianity whatsoever. They were just asking me about the Constitution. So we went through some history about it. We went through some forbidden history about it. And I think it was a pretty good episode, chock full of information. So I hope you enjoy it. As I say, libertarianchristians.com is the website for those folks. Now, before we get started today, I would like to say a quick word on behalf of my friends over at Free Talk Live, where I've been a guest before. They've got the largest pro-liberty radio program in the world. It's a panel of libertarians. They'll take calls from anyone, and they broadcast on the same stations that have major liberal and conservative hosts, so they bring the ideas of liberty to a whole new audience. Talkers Magazine calls them the number 29 most important radio show in the U.S., and that's the only site that does an overall ranking. So definitely check out the podcast, which you can get at listen.freetalklive.com. Those guys are worth listening to. All right, you're ready? Here comes some fun Constitution info, even for those of you who claim you don't care about the Constitution. Here we go.
Tom, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, gentlemen.
When I started becoming a libertarian about a little over a decade ago, you were one of the biggest influences in understanding how America was founded, the Constitution, the principles of liberty, economics, and I suspect that a lot of our listeners have heard you in the past and are indebted to you for all of your support in our education. I mean, you just pump out so much material. So I just want to thank you. It's just amazing to be talking to somebody who has pumped out so much material that we can just, it'd take a lifetime to consume it all. So I don't know how you keep going, but I'm so glad you do.
Well, I sure appreciate that. Very kind of you to say.
So we're here to talk about the Constitution, and inevitably we'll talk a little bit about American history as we do that. The reason I wanted to bring it up is because it seems to me that most people don't really respect the Constitution very much. And when I say most people, I'm talking about the people I kind of encounter on Facebook or, some of the articles that you might read, oftentimes from the left. I mean, anytime there's a shooting, we have to end up talking about Second Amendment. And there's just a lot of, you could call it disrespect, but it really just seems like people think that the document is useless or it's archaic or, as Obama said, it's just a piece of paper. I think he was being a little more respectful with that in context. But people just kind of like, it was written so long ago, it doesn't really apply today. Is the Constitution still important? And as libertarians, is there any usefulness to it for us?
All right. Well, it's a complicated answer because there are ways that I think it is important, even though in the grand scheme of things, I tend to side with Lysander Spooner on the Constitution. So anyway, let's unpack all that. First of all, the fact that we have a First Amendment that recognizes the freedom of speech, doesn't grant us the freedom of speech, obviously, but it recognizes that it exists, I think has seeped into our culture to the point that the United States is where you would least expect some of these anti-free speech laws to be passed. It's because I think that people who want to pass laws like that would be running up against something that is ingrained in who we are as Americans. And I think part of the reason it's ingrained in who we are as Americans is that it is written down in the Bill of Rights. And I don't think that can be denied. I think that is a major reason that Americans feel this commitment to freedom of speech, because they feel like it's part of what it means to be an American, because there it is in one of the foundational documents, one of the crucial documents in all of American history, highlights it in the very First Amendment. So there is that. Secondly, I would say that certainly people who argue, there are things you can say against the Constitution, but if you're going to argue that it's not worth our time because it's old and it was written by white people and some of them held slaves and whatever, if that's your argument, that's, I think, not helpful, because what that argument always leads to is what we need is a document that changes with the times. You know, they call it a living, breathing Constitution, because it's, frankly, it's kind of an annoyance to have a document that is so strictly interpreted that we can't do all the things we want. We can't implement all the programs we want because the original understanding of the Constitution wouldn't allow them. Well, thankfully, we've moved past that archaic way of interpreting it, they would say. And instead now we have a very flexible way of interpreting it. We interpret the General Welfare Clause very broadly. We interpret several other clauses very broadly. And that allows us to do the kinds of things that a strict interpretation of the Constitution would not allow. So they'll say that it's great that in this day and age, you know, we are no longer chained to the strict words of the Constitution, but, you know, we're more or less observing the general purpose of the Constitution, which was to foster the general welfare. You get arguments like that. I have no respect for that argument whatsoever. And you can see all over the place the framers of the Constitution making clear that that is not a legitimate argument. It's not like they didn't think of that. They thought of it and rejected it. And so when the people ratified the Constitution, they ratified it with the understanding that you can't just change it informally because it's getting to be a pest and it's an annoyance that you have to go to all this trouble to amend the Constitution to get it to be the way you want. Alexander Hamilton even said that it may be that people want the Constitution to say something that it doesn't say. And it may even be that for years and years they act as if it says something other than what it actually says. But that is no substitute for the solemn decision by the people in the form of an amendment to change the document. That until that happens, we presume that the original meaning is in effect. Now, that's Alexander Hamilton talking. I think that was Federalist 69, if I remember that correctly. That's even Alexander Hamilton talking. And remember, especially given the time of year that this episode is being released, let's bear in mind the significance of the American War for Independence for constitutional history is that the Americans were fighting against the British Constitution and what it had become. The British Constitution had indeed become a living, breathing constitution. It was not written down, and that was part of the reason that Americans later decided they would write theirs down, because they found that arguing against the British Constitution or arguing a case and using the British Constitution as part of your argument was like nailing jelly to a wall, because they could not precisely nail down what it said, because the Americans would say, what you're doing, let's say in barging our doors down and invading our private homes to snoop around, that is not something that's been considered to be a customary power of the British government. Therefore, you can't do it. And it's unconstitutional. But then they would come back and say, but Parliament authorized whatever X, Y, or Z thing that you're upset about. And so therefore it's ipso facto constitutional. Well, that's not how Americans understood the British Constitution. So it became this document you could never nail down, and the government was always finding wonderful new powers for it to exercise. Well, that's what Americans fought against. So the idea that we would want to prefer that system for ourselves today when our ancestors fought to liberate us from that system is particularly perverse. So let me just recap what I've said so far. The argument that the Constitution should be living and breathing is refuted by the American Revolution itself. We were fighting against that very system. But at the same time, I would say that I personally don't believe that any piece of paper is going to restrain people who want to exercise power. If all you have is a piece of paper and it's not backed by a will to resist, then it's not going to be worth a whole lot. And that really is the problem that we face today. We have all the arguments in the world that the Constitution really does support only a very limited government. But if you give an institution a monopoly on the power to tax and the power to initiate physical force, why would they limit themselves to that? Why would they say, well, the Constitution says X and Y? Why wouldn't what has happened be expected to happen, where the law schools are totally corrupted, where people are taught constitutional law in a way that justifies the government in its compendious interpretation of its powers? You get a complete corruption of the legal profession by people who want to be part of the game. They want to be part of that system. They don't want to live under some limited government where they have no powers. So we have this system where most people are raised to believe that the Constitution is very flexible, very malleable, even though if you just read the ratifying conventions and the wording that was decided on at the Philadelphia Convention, it would be quite clear that that is not the original intent. I think this is not very hard to prove. But so in other words, why would you not expect this outcome, where instead of politicians scrupulously observing the limits on their power, they're constantly grasping for more and more power. And meanwhile, other people who are power hungry wind up spinning justifications for why these people are correct. That's how it's actually turned out.
So I can imagine a critic listening to what you're saying here say, oh, okay, so they elaborated, they wrote it down, they spent a lot of time arguing and elaborating on what the meaning was. We can go back and kind of understand if we just kind of, I think of the General Commerce Clause about, regulate, and the word regulate means something completely different than what it does today. And so if we understand what it meant to them and we can say, oh, well, okay, well, that's what the Constitution says, and therefore we should abide by it. But why should we listen to them? Because this is over 2 centuries later that we're dealing with problems they couldn't even conceive of. I mean, what's so special about the founding fathers? Why can't we just, not start over, but just do what we want? Because they're not around to tell us, here's why we should or shouldn't do this.
Well, you do have the amendment process for cases like that. If there really is a case that they could not have foreseen, they did foresee that they couldn't have foreseen it by introducing the amendment process. So if really we've got these intractable issues that can't be dealt with other than by amending the Constitution, then you go ahead and amend the Constitution. The danger is saying, here's what the people expressly agreed to, but gosh, those people lived so long ago. I think we can just say, forget that. But wait a minute, hold on. What kind of system of government is that? That there's this, forget that? What system of government is that? Is that a republic? Is that a democracy? Is that a monarchy? Is that an oligarchy? It seems to me that if you're going to open yourself up to, well, I know there are some principles we're supposed to be living by, but they're just getting to be such a burden. Instead of consulting the people and asking, do you want to hold, at least be honest about it. If you want to hold a new constitutional convention, at least be honest about it. At least say that's what you want to do.
You'd think people who are really against the wealthy becoming too connected with Washington would be wary of that sort of politic, yet they're not.
Right, exactly. Because this kind of argument can be turned against you 5 minutes later. Well, now we don't like your principles, so we're going to pretend like those aren't there, and we're going to presumably you would want some stability. You would want that's why we have something called the rule of law. You want some stability. You want to know what are the principles by which I'm to live my life and by which the government is to govern itself. We at least with the Constitution, you could say, at least we have something concrete that was spelled out and you can go consult it. Jefferson's view was you should not need a law school education to understand the Constitution. It was written so the average person could get what it means. At least we have that. You want to replace that with, this has become a drag, so from now on we'll just let judges decide what the government's powers are. I don't think I want to live under that. And at no time did they even have a pretense of consulting me about whether I wanted to live under that.
So along those lines, Tom, let's talk about this idea of judicial supremacy and judicial activism. One of the great historical resources that I actually learned about from you reading your work a number of years ago was the Abel Upshur essay. And for our listeners, we'll link to that. It's definitely worth reading. But the argument has to do with this idea that if the courts are a part of the government, how then can they be the judge in their own case, because we're told, oh, well, the courts are supposed to be the interpreters of what these laws and the Constitution mean, and yet they are, in fact, a part of the government. So can you talk to us about that and what the founders thought about this idea of judicial supremacy and really where it came from with the early courts?
Well, judicial supremacy is certainly not evident if we look at any of the debates surrounding the Constitution. It is the branch that is discussed by far the least. And if it was imagined that the courts would have the kind of powers we grant them today, where major social issues are just decided by 9 people, you better believe it would have generated a heck of a lot more discussion at the time than it did. So I personally am interested in the approach taken by Jefferson, which was the idea of concurrent review, where all 3 branches have a responsibility to uphold the Constitution. It's not like the judges are divinities, and so we refer all our controversies to them. The president also has to uphold the Constitution. That should be part of how he decides whether or not to veto something. The Congress should uphold the Constitution by not passing legislation that's unconstitutional. So certainly there's that. Now, I do believe sometimes people get this wrong. They say there's no justification, there's no basis for the idea of judicial review, where the courts would review legislation and pronounce on its constitutionality. I think there is evidence for that in the ratifying conventions, that it was taken for granted that there would be, on a limited basis at least, not in a crazy, the crazy hyper example of it we have now, but on a limited basis, there would be some judicial review. But from the Jeffersonian point of view, the court's role would be largely advisory, so that, okay, everybody knows what the courts have said, and then you proceed from there. But it really is a case where the government is deciding its own case. Now, you may say, but the courts are separate from the executive and the legislative branches, so they are somewhat independent. Well, that's true. They do collect their salaries, however, from the federal government. That doesn't mean that that's going to make it impossible for them to be impartial. But certainly if you were ever in a situation where you were in a dispute and somebody seriously proposed that the same person you're in a dispute with, the person you're in a dispute with is going to be decided by people who are paid by the person you're in a dispute with. You know, you wouldn't agree to that. You say, this is obviously stacked against me. But especially in the current case, where the vast majority of law students are being educated in a system that holds up federal supremacy as the norm, that holds it up as the desirable outcome, as the norm, as what the Constitution demands. And if your case relies on an argument that we live in a decentralized republic, and that, after all, every time the Constitution refers to the United States, it refers to it in the plural because it conceives of the U.S. as a decentralized collection of societies. If your case rests on that type of argument, well, there's nobody on the court really who will have been educated in that line of argument, even though that is the indisputably correct line of argument. And so you're up against a monopoly legal system where all the arguments you might want to make to defend yourself are more or less ruled out because they're the opposite of what these people learned in law school, where this is why my friend Kevin Gutzman says, make sure you don't confuse the Constitution with so-called constitutional law. The Constitution is one thing. You can figure out what the Constitution means by consulting the ratifying conventions. That's what Madison and Jefferson told us to do. But instead, what people learn is not that. They learned so-called constitutional law, which is a collection of iconic Supreme Court decisions, many of which were wrongly decided if we use the Constitution and the original intent of the Constitution as the lodestar. And therefore, you are put in a position where you are not really getting a fair shake because the arguments you might make that are completely correct are automatically ruled out because the monopoly legal system you have to argue it in, it consists of people who've been trained in the opposite view.
One of the things that you sort of touched on there, Tom, was the form of the Union. And there, amongst the founding fathers, especially like from the Hamiltonian wing compared to the Jeffersonian wing, there were definitely some different sort of views in what kind of a system they we're at least trying to get towards ideally. So can you break down the difference between sort of the monarchical and nationalistic views of the Union and the federal or compact views of the Union, and how that sort of played out in these early debates?
Well, there certainly were people who there was a continuum, no doubt, but on the extremes of that continuum, you certainly can find people who wanted, for example, the national legislature, they imagined themselves creating, to have plenary powers. That is to say, they could formulate legislation on more or less any topic they wanted to, and this would have basically followed in the footsteps of the British model. There were others who thought that the government being created ought to be more limited and ought to have only those powers that are delegated to it in the Constitution. Indeed, expressly delegated. That was the language used in at least half a dozen ratifying conventions, and that was how they understood the Constitution. Only those powers expressly delegated. And moreover, the ideas of the we might call the compact theory of the Union, whereby the Union is not one indivisible blob. The world was lousy with that. Big indivisible blobs. The world's got plenty of those. We want to be different. Remember all these people who talk about the American exceptionalism and we're so different. And so many of those people then go on to interpret the Constitution as if the United States is the same as every country in the world. It's not. It's meant to be a federation. The American founding fathers were very fond of the Dutch Federation, for example. The idea there is that the primary units of the United States are not isolated individuals that government can just steamroll over. The constituent parts are the states, because the states, after all, existed before there was a federal union. Obviously, you have a bride and groom before you have a marriage. You have states before you have a federal union. And the states, therefore, decide that they want to join this union, but the states are the primary units in it. And so that's why somebody like James Madison could say in the Report of 1800 that there are cases where all three branches may fail us. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches could all fail us and betray the Constitution. And in that case, in the last resort, it falls upon the original parties to the Constitution to resolve the question. Well, who are the original parties to the Constitution? Not an undifferentiated mass of individuals, but rather the individual states. And of course, look at the way the Constitution was ratified, not by a national vote by a big blob, not by a vote of an undifferentiated mass of individuals, but by what? By conventions in each of the states, because the states were the building blocks. So everything about early American history would make you believe that the compact theory of the Union, whereby what we have is a compact among states, not a single blob being created, but a compact among states. We see that in the Declaration of Independence. There's a reference to these states, not this soon-to-be blob, but these independent states. And as international law was understood in the 18th century, the fact that you join a confederation does not mean that you are forfeiting your sovereignty, as if that were even possible. So in other words, just because a state joins the Union under the Constitution doesn't mean that it loses its power, its powers over a variety of areas. It may delegate some powers to a federal government for the sake of its own convenience, but that's for the sake of its own convenience. It could recall those powers if it wanted to, but that's not what we're taught. Of course, in fact, what I just described to you, most people would think of as treason. That's how bizarre the situation is. What I described to you is America. What I described to you is the Constitution. What I described to you is all of American history leading up through 1800 and beyond, where in the early republic, the states believed they could resist if the Constitution was violated. We see southern states doing that, but much more often we see northern states doing it. We see people casually discussing secession because, of course, the Union is not some idol to be worshipped. It's a merely utilitarian contrivance, and if it doesn't work out, we'll try some other arrangement. Meanwhile, we have people calling themselves conservatives who have made an idol out of what is obviously just of all things to make idols out of, a political arrangement has got to be the most debased possible candidate for that. So point that I've tried to make to people over time is that when you look at American history, what do you see over and over again? You see the states, before there was a federal union, exercising the attributes of sovereignty, even when they were still not even recognized as states by much of the world. Even during the American Revolution, you see some of the states exercising attributes of sovereignty. During the American Revolution, it was decided that the crime of treason would be conceived of as not having been committed against a blob of states, but as against individual states, because that's what the United States is. Or, as they used to say, that's what the United States are. So that, in fact, you don't even find, I would say for the first 30, 40 years of American history, you don't even find a systematically argued out position opposing this, the so-called nationalist view, where what we have indeed is a single blob and the states are merely administrative units of the central government. You don't even see that spelled out in any systematic way till probably the 1830s, whereas the compact theory of the Union was spelled out repeatedly, like in the 1790s by John Taylor of Caroline or by St. George Tucker or these great early jurists, because that was the thing. It wasn't – that's why there are people who say – I think it's Brian McClanahan who says, I don't want to talk about the compact theory. I want to talk about the compact fact.
Hey folks, Norman Horn here from LCI. Would you do us a quick favor and rank us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe to us? High rankings helps us get the word out there. And now let's get back to the show.
How did we get from this important foundational principle of the founding of the United States to people saying that when people utter the word states' rights, they're being racist? Like, it just seems like a complete you can explain how we got there if you have a theory on that. But how do you what do you say to leftists who say that, oh, well, that's just a white supremacist or, a racist way of talking about, government?
Okay. Well, first of all, that just shows they have an IQ of 50, because they're not going to argue me on the merits. They're going to argue with me on some consequence that they expect might occur as a result of this. Look, if you want to look around the world at central governments and how they've treated the minorities that have lived within their borders, and you want to take that position as against states' rights, I'll take states' rights any day of the week. You want to take the Soviet Union and its record against minorities? You want to take the Soviet Union and its record against the Ukrainians? Or I could find African countries and their record against the Asian minorities that have lived there. I could look at the Armenian minority in the Ottoman among the Ottoman Turks, and I could go on with cases where central governments have gone after minorities in ways that are particularly vile. Now, sure, states have also gone after minorities because they're states, and they tend to have terrible people running them. So nobody has clean hands here. And I'm not saying that we should in any way support the states blindly, but I am saying that if you break power up into little bits, it's going to be a lot more difficult to carry out atrocities against any sort of people than if all jurisdiction is held in the hands of one source. Now, I hate to fall into this trap of referring to Hitler, but it's just too easy in this case, because Hitler said right there in Mein Kampf, he said that we got to get away from this whole states' rights thing in Germany, because we need to have one voice to be able to express its will through the whole country. Okay, so in other words, you're telling me that you're going to say, well, Hitler was wrong about some things, but when it comes to political organization, I sure side with him. Are you sure that's the position you want to take? And then secondly, let me point out that when I argued this position at the Yale Political Union last year, I ended up making the audio of that into an episode of the Tom Woods Show. So if you go to tomwoods.com/episodes, and you look for Yale on the page, you'll find it. And we had one of these Yale kids who got up and said, so far we haven't mentioned race and slavery. And I feel like that's central to this. And I just thought, it's like I planted that kid in the audience. Just get out of my way. Let me get up there and smack this down. And I did. And I went through and I said, all right, yeah. You want to do that? You want to talk about race and argue that that's what this is all about? Now, leave aside that the federal Constitution allowed for slavery. So that's not like some just mere state constitution. This was understood to be allowed from the start, and there were federal fugitive slave laws. There is plenty plenty of blame to go around when it comes to slavery. But if you're going to say that that the states and arguments for the states were motivated by race or slavery, then how do you explain the fact that the first time the states really proposed resisting a federal law was over the freedom of speech in the Alien and Sedition Acts case of 1798, Virginia and Kentucky? Or the New England states asserted their powers as states, even proposing secession over the embargo that Jefferson imposed. Some of them were very much opposed to the War of 1812. And in fact, Daniel Webster proposed that they should nullify any federal conscription law that was carried out. So that's nothing to do with certainly with racial slavery. It would have to do with military slavery, I suppose. Then you have the Tariff of Abominations that was nullified in 1832-33. Again, this is not related to slavery. Everybody at the time was talking about nothing but tariffs over and over and over. That's all they talked about. And then in the 1850s, with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you had a number of states that thought that was unconstitutional, that just because there's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution doesn't mean you can do any old thing you want to enforce that clause. So, in fact, you had the Wisconsin of all places, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court held that its legislature was completely in the right in resisting that act. And then they quoted Thomas Jefferson in talking about the power to nullify unconstitutional federal law. So understand, when there was an attempt, so in other words, there was no state that tried to nullify an anti-slavery law, because really, how many anti-slavery laws were there? So obviously, this was not a pro-slavery thing, the idea of state nullification of unconstitutional federal laws. There weren't any federal laws against slavery to nullify in the first place. So, but when it came time for the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court quoted Jefferson saying, we have the right to say, no, we're not enforcing an unconstitutional law. So in fact, the idea of state nullification, not only was it not used to support slavery, it was used against slavery. So now I've taken us up through, well, many decades of American history to show that the principles of the powers of the states have been used for all kinds of honorable and noble purposes. And you'll say, oh, but in the 20th century, it was used for purposes that we find distasteful. Governments are going to do things that you find distasteful. But is that but the point is, if you look at the whole sweep of American history, the whole sweep of American history shows that this principle was used to fight against oppression time and again. It's not infallible, because anytime you're dealing with government, you're going to deal with bad people. That can't be helped. But when you look at the overall record of centralized states versus decentralized regimes, the decentralized regimes constantly come out better for reasons that should be obvious, which is why you don't generally run into a huge list of dictators who say, now that I'm in power, I'm going to make sure I have as little power as possible, and I decentralize power into as many small areas as I possibly can. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Because that runs counter to what every dictator in the world has ever wanted.
So along these lines, Tom, we've talked a lot here about many of the positive things from the founding generation, and especially from the Jeffersonian wing. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the negative things about the Constitution, because we're often told that, especially by conservatives and people who have let's say, a very keen sense of personal patriotism, that, the Constitution was really meant to limit the government. But when you actually go back and look at it compared to the Articles of Confederation, it's the exact opposite. The Constitution was meant to increase the size and scope of government over and above what we had under the Articles. So I kind of have a two-part question here. Number one, what do you think American society would look like today had we stayed under the Articles? And number two, could an argument be made that the Constitution itself is, quote unquote, unconstitutional because of the dubious way in which the Constitutional Convention was called against the orders that were present under the Articles of Confederation to modify the Articles?
Oh, yeah. Certainly nobody was authorized to just scrap that thing and throw it in the garbage, the articles. So that's certainly extra legal. On the other hand, they could come back and say, but we took what we did that was extra legal and we put it up to a vote through the state conventions. And the argument at that time was that the people in their highest capacity, their highest voice, is expressed by means of the state convention. And so if they say it's okay, then, we're off the hook. So that, I think, would be the way they would argue. Now, in terms of the living under the Articles of Confederation, it's hard to argue this point because we've all been raised in the same way of thinking. Like it's so obvious that the Constitution was better. It's so obvious that it's not even considered to be worth considering just as a thought experiment, the alternatives. And I can't remember, this was a while ago, I'll grant you, but I checked out of curiosity how many likes on Facebook the Articles of Confederation had. Just out of curiosity, because the Constitution had millions of likes, something like that. Well, we love the Constitution because our teachers told us it was great, and that the system that preceded it was obviously stupid and backward. And you don't want to be stupid and backward, do you? And in fact, let me check right now. I'm just dying to know. I'm dying to know.
I'm looking it up right now. Let's look.
Yeah, how many likes for the Articles of Confederation? Well, let's see. Well, I'm actually trying to find one group called the Articles of Confederation. It's hard to find. Articles of Confederation, there's a community with 19 people who like it. There's a book about it. There is something called the Articles of Articles of Confederation, 7 people.
Articles of Confederation Explained. That's the highest number at 2,900.
Yeah, and even that's not the document itself. That's just, hey, I like having it explained. So now I can't even find it anymore. Now, that's weird. That's Orwellian. That it's not, trust me, the argument for the Constitution was not so obvious that nobody should even consider thinking about the alternative. I mean, that's the kind of result you get when somebody runs for president, one of these backwater third world countries, and they get 99.9% of the vote, and we look at it, we say, something's screwy there. Well, something's screwy here too. Because yes, it's true that there were problems on the Articles of Confederation. That's true. But the problems under the Constitution make those. Remember how they used to say in like the 1980s and 90s that in the 1950s, we had problems with the schools. But when you look at the complaints of the teachers, it was chewing gum, talking in class. Now it's like murder and drug dealing and all that. And you say, geez, I mean, I guess I shouldn't have complained so much when it was just gum chewing. That's how I feel about the Articles of Confederation. Whatever problems we had, all right, one state wants to impose a tariff on another. All right, eventually you convince people that's not in your interest. You work that out. But when you look at the problems of the U.S. government today and all these agencies and the bureaucracy and how you can't ever seem to scale any of it back because it all has a life of its own, that it exists for the sake of its further preservation. It exists for the sake of increasing that budget. And then it'll spend every cent to prove that next year it needs a bigger budget. And then, we citizens may try to cut that budget, but we have lives and jobs and families, whereas they spend 24 hours a day lobbying for increased budgets for their agency. Not to mention the catastrophe of a foreign policy we have. There's no way in a decentralized America that there would have been a decision to, let's have this same Middle Eastern policy that's just been so super for the past 15 or so years. It's no way. Or that it would have been thought, it's clearly the right thing to do to enter World War I. Can't see any negative consequences coming from that. There are ways in which the world would be dramatically different in dramatically better ways that we never even consider because we just assume that progress means more centralization. In fact, that's the tone that you get in your history textbook when they talk about, for example, the centralization of Italy or the centralization of Germany in the 19th century. That's just assumed to be part of the general unstoppable sweep of history, that you go from stupid, backward decentralization to forward-looking, positive centralization. Oh, yeah? Well, you know what? Maybe the 20th century would be a lot different if there hadn't been German centralization. How about that? Has anybody even bothered to stop and think of that? No, we don't, because we have this prejudice in favor of centralization. Or why was it that all the different areas of Italy, whether it was from Piedmont to Sicily, why is it great? Why is that necessarily great that there would be a movement to meld them into one people and thereby suppress a lot of the distinguishing characteristics of the different regions. Why is that better? The same people who yammer on and on about diversity are the same ones who don't even bother to ask this question. Of course it's better for there to be one Italy, citizen. I don't think that way. I think we need to think in new and fresh ways. And that's when I look at the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution, I look at it in this big picture. And when I look at the problems under the Constitution, I say, any day of the week, give me the Articles of Confederation. I'm prepared to deal with those problems.
And one of the other interesting things is that this isn't just something that cropped up in the 20th century. The violations of the quote-unquote original intent of the Constitution began almost immediately by some of the very same people who wrote the thing. I mean, you mentioned the Alien and Sedition Act. Even Jefferson, when he was considering the Louisiana Purchase, is kind of thinking like, well, technically this is unconstitutional and there should be an amendment, but I don't really have time to get an amendment. So can you just talk about how quickly this sort of broke down and what that says for any kind of hope or attempt that we're somehow going to get back to the original intent and stick with it this time around?
Yeah, you could say it broke down immediately because already, like by 1790, 1791, like the early 1790s, Patrick Henry is already complaining and saying now, out of Virginia, already complaining. What is going on here? Because of just even things that today we would consider benign. But if you were really, really a stickler about the Constitution and you wanted to make sure they didn't step 1 inch off that document, then things like, the assumption of the state debts by the federal government or, at par, or, the national bank or any of these early controversies, you would say, now, hold on just a minute. In fact, Hamilton had to develop this whole implied powers thing to justify the national bank. But that doctrine in the hands of unscrupulous people would justify almost anything. So he's already prepared to do that and to say, yes, we need a national bank and it seems necessary. And, I have this method of constitutional interpretation whereby if we elites think something is necessary, we can come up with a rationalization to implement it. They were doing that in the early 1790s. And they're already on the House floor. You've got James Madison having to complain about the interpretation of the General Welfare Clause and the way people are thinking about the Constitution. They're getting it all wrong already. And you still see evidence that some people understood the original Constitution, like Madison when he was president. The bonus bill veto, that's a great thing. If you've never read that, you should Google and read the bonus bill veto. He just wasn't letting them get away with anything. Even again, things you would think of as benign, like bridges or whatever. His view was if it's a bridge that you want to build with federal money, then you better amend the Constitution to authorize you to do that. Otherwise, we have no Constitution. But yes, very early you see these sorts of problems, which makes you wonder, maybe we are, again, reposing our confidence in an idol if we think a piece of paper is going to restrain people who have no interest in being restrained. And then you say, oh, but the people, they will be the solemn watch, the solemn guards over the – really? Will they? Look at how easily and quickly the American public was corrupted. We'll cut you in on it. We'll cut you in on a bit of the action as long as you shut your mouth about it. And it looks like a lot of people have been quite happy to take that deal.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the amendments because, those are the things that become talked about when, for instance, there's a school shooting or an egregious violation of free speech. So why does it seem that some amendments are sacred to some people on one side of the political spectrum while others are kind of sacred on the other side of the political spectrum, and they have a lot less respect for some of the ones their opponents are in favor of?
I think that's just human nature. I think it's the same reason that everybody would have been up in arms if Hillary Clinton had passed the current federal budget, but they bite their tongue because it's Donald Trump and vice versa. I think it's the reason that people were all upset about George W. Bush's foreign policy and his position on civil liberties and things like that. But then when it's Barack Obama, they deprioritize that. Unfortunately,
they packed up their protesting signs and went home.
Yeah, I think that's just, unfortunately, the way people are. We tend to be very tribalistic, and politics only encourages that in the worst ways imaginable.
Do you have any amendments that you would remove or maybe even add?
I don't know. I'd have to go back and think about amendments I would remove. Well, obviously, the 16th Amendment, certainly, for the income tax. I'd get rid of that. There are probably some other. I'd have to sit and think about it, but certainly the income tax I would take away. In terms of amendments that I would add, let's see. I think Jefferson wanted to prohibit the government from ever borrowing. Now, that's a very radical approach. Of course, that just means they'd inflate. And you think, well, don't worry, we'll have an amendment against them inflating. But, if you actually read there's a guy named Edwin Vieira who wrote one of the largest books I've ever seen called Pieces of Eight. And it's a history of money in the Constitution and in constitutional law. And it's quite clear from what Vieira writes that the framers did envision a hard money system. It's true that, that the stuff about gold and silver in there, is dealing with the states. But still, when you look at, for example, what the word dollar meant, and the word dollar is in the Constitution. If you look, for example, about when we're talking about having cases heard and trial by jury and stuff like that, there's a reference to $20, right? If the case involves a matter of $20 or more. We've kept that even to the present day. Well, what does dollar mean? There was no Fed creating dollars in those days. Dollar it was a specific kind of coin that existed at that time. So there's a reference to you can reconstruct what Americans at that time thought about money, in large part from just reading what's in the Constitution and what the commentaries on it were. And even there, they got out from under that. So it's very, very hard to take these powers away from them when they want to exercise them. If they want to exercise them, they're going to come up with some way. If the only obstacle standing between them and enriching themselves is coming up with some half-baked interpretation of some clause, that it's going to happen. But, there are if you have lower expectations, in other words, if you think there's an amendment I can pass that will keep the government strictly limited, I think you're expecting too much. They've proven that that's not going to work. But if you could change the institutional structure of the thing, then maybe so in other words, it wouldn't depend on the interpretation of some clause, but it would depend on the way you're setting it up. Then there are ways I think you might be able to limit government. And for example, what if we said that if 26 states voted to repeal a federal law, it could be repealed? Well, I don't see any way you could interpret that wouldn't allow it to work. So in other words, you don't have to worry that they'll interpret that in some crazy way. I don't see how you could. I don't think there is a way to do that. And I think, that wouldn't solve all our problems. But if there are deeply unpopular laws and Congress, let's just imagine a world in which Congress is unresponsive. Imagine that. You would have a second institutional way of bringing it about. So in other words, if I passed a law, if I ratified an amendment saying, we're not going to allow laws to pass on the following topics. Well, then they just reinterpret what topics means or something. Then I have no hope of that working. But if I have an institutional way of stopping it, where we don't have to rely on the interpretation of some sentence, but instead the states, let's say, could say, we don't like this law, we want it repealed, maybe that could lead to the repeal of some laws. So I would want to institute, in other words, more modest amendments like that, because the more modest they are, the better chance they have of working.
We're releasing this episode the week of 4th of July in 2018. And, I've always kind of looked at the 4th of July as sort of like a Thanksgiving for libertarians. Like there's a lot to be thankful for that we live in a country that started off with the kind of document where individual freedom was prioritized, was not taken for granted. How do you see the 4th of July personally? I mean, do you celebrate it? Is it important to you? And if so, what do you recommend libertarians to do with respect to, on the 4th of July?
Well, I like it. I support it. I do know some people. I know a few libertarians, and I know plenty of hard right-wing traditionalist types who don't celebrate it. But I don't see that we would be in a better position if we had stayed under the British. They're even worse than we are in all the areas that matter to me. I mean, on the other hand, that's not the only option. A third option would be that a peaceful resolution of our differences could have been effected, and that certainly is possible. We can't rule that out. But yeah, I celebrate it because I like the general principles of it, and I certainly like the idea of decentralization and a grouping of states that did come together for a common purpose, but that otherwise are just a grouping of states and a recognition of individual rights and stuff like that. I think that's something to be celebrated. So, I like once in a while to be able to be just a regular American and not have to be dissenting from everything 24 hours a day. I feel like Independence Day gives me a chance to be a regular American for one day out of my life, and I'll take it.
Well, that's a good reason to celebrate, I suppose. So, we're going to end with that. Tom, thanks for being with us and for giving us, an introduction a bit to the Constitution, some of the history behind it. We really enjoyed our time together.
I appreciate that. If people like any of this stuff, they will probably enjoy the Tom Woods Show at tomwoods.com. And I have a bunch of books that I actually give away for free at tomsfreebooks.com. So check those out because they're very zingy and they will help you win debates just in case you happen to run across an uninformed person on Facebook. If that should ever happen, then tomsfreebooks.com will bail you out.
Well, great. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes page as well. And thanks again, Tom.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, that is our program for today. Remember, this week and next, just 3 episodes a week because I've got so much going on. But we're still producing an episode of Contra Krugman every week, which you can check out over at contrakrugman.com. Thanks for listening.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.